Thank you for joining us today. I think that we will go to our next slide and we can move on from here. I wanted to point out that I am actually also a small scale farmer in addition to my work as communications manager for the Pesticide Action Network. And I wanted to share a little bit of our story so you understood where I'm coming from and where our story is centered around. We are a 15-acre small-scale diversified farm that was established in 2004. So we've been doing this this is our 20th year, which is hard for us to believe sometimes. We have been Practical Farmers of Iowa members since 2007, and we were certified organic for several years until we began scaling our farm back a little bit. We have currently some direct-to-consumer markets. We grow some vegetables for seed production now, and then we donate extra to the food bank. Prior to that, we did farmers markets. We had a farm share or CSA program. We sold to restaurants in a retirement village. We raised vegetables, poultry, and vegetable seed. And you can kind of see when I started working for Pesticide Action Network, it was in March of 2020, right about when the pandemic hit. Let's look at the next slide. So our story starts on July 27th, 2012. I was outside at the time in the evening doing some of the chores that I needed to do at the time. And at that moment, we had a plane fly over our farm. And the plane was trying to hit a nearby soybean field, and they did not turn the nozzles off as they went over myself, the poultry field nearby, our high tunnel, and one of our production fields. And they went over multiple passes with the sprayer on and did hit our farm fairly significantly. And I want you to take note that this was Friday evening. And it was a difficult time to get sprayed, of course, because there's nobody we can really call or talk to get any kind of response or help at that point in time. We had a whole weekend to stew about what had just happened and try and figure out what we needed to do once Monday came around. So that's kind of what we're looking at here. We got some pictures because I had a camera with me at the time, and I was already sprayed. So it's like, well, what am I going to do now? Let's go to the next slide. So here's an overhead picture of our farm. This is a fairly recent picture. I think it was 2021 actually. And you can kind of get an idea where some of our production is. The right-hand side would be to the east, and that's where a lot of the vegetable production is. But you'll notice there's a high tunnel in the center north, and in the southwest, another high tunnel, some production fields, probably our most productive land down there, and pasture on the top left, which would be where we have typically turkeys and chickens. The spray area would have been the western half or the left part of what you see here. So it would have hit a high tunnel. It would have hit an area where turkeys and laying hens were. It would have hit the building that you see there that also had bees nearby. And of course, it would have caused problems for the vegetables we had both in that productive field and in the high tunnel. Let's take a look at the next slide. So in the spray zone, one of the things that I wanted to do while I'm talking about this is there are a lot of things we don't always think about when there's a pesticide misapplication or drift, especially as a vegetable producer, that became very apparent to us rapidly. For example, we had just cleaned out and sanitized containers for harvest and for transport. We were using towels for various things for cleaning and whatever, and they were out hanging on a line. Of course, we had bees and we had equipment sitting out in the spray zone. And those are things you don't usually think about, that if you have drift and you are a food producer, some of the equipment and some of the things that you use can also get coated in that spray, and you have a responsibility for cleaning all those things up before you end up putting more food that people are going to eat into those containers or with using the equipment that's there. So that's just something that we didn't think about until it actually happened to us. And I think some folks might benefit from recognizing that there are more things you need to do after a drift event than you might think. Let's look at the next slide. So I wanted to just talk about this very briefly as an overall reason why we should have concerns about pesticide drift and misapplication. The first one as a food producer is the fact that we have to always be concerned about food safety. And many of the chemicals that are being used on the field crops that maybe might be adjacent to a food production field, they're not rated for the crops that we are often giving to people to eat that's fresh food. And because they're not rated for that, or they have a setback period where you have to wait X number of days before they're safe for consumption, you have to be very concerned that anything that got hit is probably unsafe food, and you cannot be selling that or giving that to people because you may end up being liable for that if they get sick. And of course, the other thing is many of us who have small scale farms, we often employ other people to help us with the farm. In our case, it's typically high school and college students. And so these are your children. And it is our responsibility to get these workers, get these people out of the field and out of the spray zone if we notice that there's spraying going on, there's potential for drift. So worker safety is one of the things we're really concerned about. And of course, you can consider sensitive crops and pollinators. And of course, we had animals on the farm that got sprayed. All those things are fairly common sense things that we should be concerned about when it comes to drift. And then as far as I'm concerned, being a small vegetable farm with diversified crops, we don't carry the same kind of insurance that a row cropper does. So if we lose crops, then we have a problem with uncompensated losses. And then the one thing that we don't always think about is how much more work we have to do after a spray event. So let's take a look at the next slide, see what we've got here. So here's an example of some particle herbicide drift. You can see the fairly uniform droplets, yellowed spots on the leaves of these cucumbers. This is what we observed in a different event. This was, I think, 2015. I don't recall exactly. But there was a day where we had somebody doing ground spraying in a field across the road, and the wind was very strong. We did approach the applicator to try and get them to stop, but of course they did not. And the next day, of course, all of the damage was showing itself on pretty much every kind of plant we had in the field. And this is a pretty good indicator you've had particle herbicide drift. If you notice a wide range of plants exhibiting the same spotting, that pretty much eliminates a disease or something specific to that plant type. Let's take a look at the next slide. Another kind of drift is something that has become a little bit more common, and this is something I think Mark will talk about more. But we also have pesticides that are volatile, and they can actually become a vapor again after they've been applied, especially if the temperatures or the application time are appropriate for it. And so sometimes things like dicamba or 2,4-D can volatilize and drift. And sometimes it is not necessarily a simple thing to figure out where the drift came from, and yet you can still see damage to your vegetable crops in particular. And that's something more we need to look at. There are other kinds of drift. We can have drift with water events, and we're not going to talk about those. But the two that are most likely that we would be talking about from our perspective would be particle or vapor drift. Let's look at the next slide. All right, so I wanted to show you another picture just because it looked like fun. You'll notice there's a picture of pea leaves down there. These are from the same field that had the cucumbers. We like to plant both of those crops in an intermix style or an intercrop style. And you'll notice the same dotting on these plants. And one is from a cucurbit family and the other one is a legume. And fairly clear that they don't have the same diseases necessarily causing them problems in this case. And it was immediately the next morning after application that this was observed. All right, next slide. So if you are in a situation where you have sensitive crops or you're living next to a field that's going to be sprayed or any of these particular things, if you notice that somebody is going to be setting up to spray in your field, or you have been lucky enough to be next to somebody who tells you in advance they're going to spray, things that you probably should do are here. You want to check the weather conditions, which way the wind's coming from, what are the temperatures going to be like. And of course, you probably want to talk to the sprayer and talk to them as civilly as you can, because remember, we're not out here trying to make people even more angry at us and make it more likely that they'll ignore our existence. We would like them to work with us so that this would actually not become a problem. But typically, because our farm is surrounded by row crops, we are always recording anytime there is spraying going on around us. So we know what the weather conditions were like, whether the wind was coming our way. We usually have a digital camera nearby so we can take pictures if there's a problem. If it's not too hot, we'll roll down our high tunnel walls, pull in workers from the field, pretty much all the things that we can do for protective measures. If there is a spray going on and there is drift, then there's a number of things you can do. Among them, of course, is trying to contact the farmer, because often the sprayer, the applicator, is not the farmer. It's often contracted to a co-op, and the co-op may contract with an aerial sprayer or with somebody else to do ground rig spraying. But the farmer might be the first person you can go to get information about who you can talk to try and deal with the situation. And if you want to, take a look at the words that are there. But I do want to emphasize something, that recording what is going on is very important for later on. If you have good records, it's going to make it a lot easier for you to deal with uncompensated losses and the regulatory portions that come later that Mark will talk about. And finally, if you are sprayed, then you can bag up your clothing, but also you need to take a long shower and get cleaned up and follow whatever processes medical experts tell you to follow, so that you can avoid being ill or injured by this situation. Let's look at the next slide. So here's an example from this particular spraying I talked about in 2012. They actually had a GPS locator on the plane, which also tracked when the nozzles were on. And we were able to secure that from the co-op that had contracted with the sprayer. So we were able to get this as evidence as to when the nozzles were on. And I know the picture's a little hard to see, but there's clear evidence that they crossed the boundaries of our fields and a field to the north. So they were not particularly careful about staying within the lines, if you will. And of course, where the nozzle gets turned off doesn't necessarily match with where the spray lands, because of course there will be some carry forward. Let's look at the next slide. Vanya, there you go. Okay, so if you have been sprayed, one of the first things that I learned after getting sprayed during that weekend when we were waiting to make contact with some of the various people who could help us is I learned how to look up pesticide use labels. This isn't something that I necessarily wanted to do, because our farm had decided very early on that we were going to grow without any kind of pesticides. But I did learn very quickly how to read use labels, and there are a couple of things, one in particular, that I want people to be aware of. Most pesticides have something called a restricted entry interval. This is the period of time after a spray that humans are not supposed to be in the spray area. So if your farm or your home or where you are has been sprayed or drifted on, then you should exit that area. If your house had windows open and you're inside and you're smelling pesticides, you probably need to find a way to get out, find out what the pesticides are, and find out how long you need to be away. That's something that we were not told. And of course, by the time I learned about the REI, we'd already been in our house and been in the chemicals for about 2 days. And it turns out the REI for a couple of the chemicals were in fact 48 hours for when we got sprayed. So we probably should have been away from the farm. Some other things that you might want to do is, if you're a grower, then you need to know what the pre-harvest intervals are for any of your crops. For example, one of the chemicals that was sprayed on us had a pre-harvest interval for green beans of 30 days. The unfortunate thing is our green beans were ready to harvest at the point that we got sprayed, which means that those green beans are not safe for consumption, and we could not sell them or eat them. And we would have to have waited for 30 days to harvest any green beans. Anybody who's grown green beans knows that you have to keep plants picked if you want them to continue to produce. But that means for 30 days, we'd be picking green beans and throwing them away in hopes that we'd have some at the end of the 30-day period. Obviously, that's probably not a very sustainable approach. So the best thing for us to do would have been to destroy the crop and hope that we could do something later. Let's look at the next slide. All right, here's another example of what use labels look like. The use labels will also have information about the required weather conditions and what things need to be like for application. And they will include health and safety related information, which would include what you need to do is if you've been exposed to the chemical, if you've got it in your eyes, whatever. So if you can find out what the pesticide was quickly and you can have someone help you find the use label, you can also find how to react to the situation yourself to maintain your own health. Next slide, please. So in our case, we got sprayed, and in fact, we have had drift a couple of times on our farm, and we have availed ourselves of the services of the Pesticide Bureau more times than we've ever wanted to. And that's no offense to Mark. We appreciate that they're there. But of course, we would rather never have been drifted on and never been sprayed in the first place. And I wanted to point out to you that as a perspective as a grower, it's extremely frustrating to get sprayed on. You are angry, you are upset. And the first thing that you end up doing often is calling the Pesticide Bureau. And it's awfully hard not to be angry and yell at the people that are simply trying to take your report. And so what I want to encourage people to do is, yes, you should call the Pesticide Bureau, especially because it helps identify larger problems with drift and pesticides moving where they're not supposed to be. But you got to be ready with a factual account. You need to keep your emotions in check. You need to have a lot of, be ready with documentation and make the job easy for them. And you need to remember that the Pesticide Bureau can't help you with compensation for damages. Their job is simply to enforce the rules that are on the use labels. So it's important that they're there, but unfortunately, they're not in a position to help a grower like myself to get past some of the other things. We have to look other places for that help. So the next slide. So one of the things that we did is we actually got instruction on how to take test samples from the representative that came from the Pesticide Bureau. And they did a good job coaching us on how to select our sites carefully, how to take samples without contaminating them, how to label them, where to place them. They instructed us to put them in a cool location. And of course, you take the samples as soon as possible, hopefully before, if it's going to rain in the forecast, you want to get it before rain. But the big critical thing here is you have to know what pesticides were sprayed, because you need to know what you were testing for when you send it to a private lab. The private lab will run the tests seeking to see if those pesticides are there. And if you don't know what they are, there's not really a good way to test for any pesticide. So it's important that you do your work and ask the right questions to find out what was sprayed so that you can actually get tests that mean something. And the turnaround is typically 2 weeks. So somebody who's a food grower like myself, who have vegetables that are ready right now, those things often you're still going to have to make decisions about whether they're safe or not without the data about whether there was any spray in that area. Next slide. All right, this is just a reminder. If you are in the spray zone, you need to take care of you. Pay attention to symptoms. Keep records about those symptoms. In my case, a couple of the major symptoms were the fact that I had a lot of trouble with breathing. I had a lot of coughing. I ended up going to the doctor and getting prednisone to work through that. But the other problem that I noticed is I work outside and have worked outside many years all the time. And I don't sunburn much, but I noticed all of a sudden I was sunburning pretty much every day. So those were a couple of the symptoms that did line up with what was on the use labels. So pay attention to your own health. Next slide. All right, so let's say I've got vegetables in the spray zone and the setback period was not met. What did we do? Let's take a look at the next slide. So one of the things that we did is we selected some sample areas for pesticide testing. And once we found out that there were positive results, that there were levels of pesticide on our crops, one of the things we did over time is we actually harvested those crops and took sample harvests so that we could record them, take pictures of them, get weights, and record. What this does is this establishes for future compensation that you did have a crop, that the crop was a healthy crop, and that it was producing appropriately. And so you have these records to show that, yes, we had the crop and it was producing per the norm and our numbers are accurate. Of course, this doesn't work if it's an herbicide issue. If you have herbicide drift and it's killing your crop, then you can also maybe look at past harvests and show evidence that the current harvest is not a good match for it. And of course, one of the other things you might want to notice is if you are a farm like ours, we had a CSA program, which is a contract to deliver produce every week. So one of the other things we did is we looked for other small farms and acquired some replacement product for our customers. It's not something we necessarily had to do, but we felt it was a good, responsible thing to do. And you should keep track of that information as well. Next slide. So I want to talk about this one in all seriousness. I have discussed drift with other people who are growers who sometimes say, well, I'm just going to go ahead and sell this. Let me point out to you that if you do sell produce that you think has been drifted on, or you're fairly certain it's been drifted on, and somebody gets sick, the person or place that will be responsible is you and your farm, not the person who did the spraying. But also, you should probably be more concerned about your customers enough that you would want to be cautious about what you're giving to them. If you are fairly certain that you have chemicals on the crop, then you need to think about whether or not you should give things to people seriously. And in our case, we typically err on the side of being cautious, and we typically will not send that until we're certain things are safe. Next slide. Okay, we had livestock or poultry. We had chickens and turkeys in the spray zone, and there are grazing setbacks in a lot of the use labels when you have to wait, how long you have to wait before you put animals back on the area that you've sprayed. And of course, the chickens and the turkeys were on the area grazing at the moment they were sprayed, so that doesn't meet the setback. So of course, we were looking for symptoms on the poultry, and we tried to find information to figure out how long it would take for them to flush these out of the toxins. Let's take a look at the next slide. So what we did is we tried to find another spot on our farm where we could have a pasture. Unfortunately, 2012 was a very dry year, so a lot of our places were very dry, and we'd actually moved our animals off of an area they'd been on to the area that they got sprayed because we were trying to keep the pasture areas healthy. But we had to move them back. And of course, we had to clean all the waters and feeders, and we had to keep some records. Let's look at the next one. Now, let me point out once again, if you want compensation and you don't have immediate insurance compensation, you need to do things to show that you're trying to mitigate your losses. So that includes cleaning things, doing what you can to continue to be a successful farm. And that's just a process you need to be aware of that you're doing. And again, keep records. Next one. So if you're seeking compensation, from our perspective, of course, one of the first things you do is you try and find an insurance representative because the people who are doing the spraying typically have an insurer. And if you can actually get the insurer to provide you with compensation for your losses, that's probably your quickest way to get it done. Of course, if you can't get those kinds of responses that you need from either the sprayer or the farmer or the insurance agent, you may have to seek legal representation, as we did for the 2012 incident. Lots of documentation. It took us about 2.5 years to get some compensation for our losses. So, of course, You can't expect, if you go the litigation route, for immediate results and to have reparations right away. Let's go to the next slide. And then I want to point this one out. This is something I think we often don't talk about enough. If you are a person who lives in a house or a small acreage or a farm, and you are the victim of drift, whether it was somebody flying over and spraying you directly like it was for us, or it was somebody nearby that sprayed on a windy day and it coated some of your vegetables, you are going to experience the grieving process. And it can be extremely traumatic. And while I don't want to make claims for PTSD necessarily, I will tell you that it has now been 11 years. And when a spray plane flies anywhere nearby, both Tammy, my spouse, and I cringe and do have a hard time with that. We respond very badly to that. The entire process, to give you a real brief idea of what it was like, in 2012, just one day before we were sprayed on, I walked our farm, and I was proud of what we were seeing on the farm. It was a drought year, and yet we were still doing great, and we were set to set records for a number of our crops, I think. We were happy with how the CSA was going. We were getting good feedback from our customers. At that moment in time, I felt like our farm had really arrived and that we were doing about as good as we could do. 24 hours later, after we were sprayed, I wanted to quit. I went from somebody who was proud and happy to be doing what I was doing to somebody who wanted to get away. And that feeling has continued with me to different degrees for the next 10 years. This is not a small thing. This is an important thing that we need to talk about. So if you have been drifted on and you are a victim of this, you need to find your people that can help support you, that you can talk to and work out your feelings, because otherwise this could eat you alive. And I want to bring that up into all of your attention. Let's look at the next slide. Hey, this is the closing slide. It looks like we're just about right on time. We might have a couple minutes where I can look at a couple questions if there are some. You'll notice that there's information on how to reach me either at the farm or at my job for Pesticide Action Network. Otherwise, you'll notice that the Sandman, our farm spokescat, is there, thanking you for your attention and allowing me to have a chance to talk to you about all of these things.
All right, thank you, Rob. I didn't got a compliment on your cat picture. They'll probably throw questions in. And we only have like a minute, so I want to keep questions to the Q&A. All right, well, thank you so much for that. And now we are going to move on to Mark Smith. Mark Smith works with the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship, and he is going to jump into it right now.
Thank you, Vanya, and thank you, Rob. Certainly, I appreciate your story, and it's one that as I hear phone calls here, certainly one that I hear over the phones, and I sympathize with anyone who has a drift incident. In fact, one of my, I would say probably my second contact with the Pesticide Bureau was first and foremost when I was certified as a pesticide applicator in the state of Iowa, which was, we'll just say, over 20 years ago. And the second was a drift incident. Actually, it wasn't a drift incident, but a pesticide misuse incident of my own that I reported before I ever worked for the department. So certainly we sympathize. We hear these stories each and every day. But just a little background on myself. I've been with the Bureau almost 4 years. I currently serve in the role that I do certification and training programs for pesticide applicators, and then I have some other responsibilities as well. So I help with the applicator training programs and the certification and licensing. Previous to that, I did spend 2 years in the field in Central Iowa as an investigator. So most of my comments here are going to come and relate to my experience as a pesticide investigator, but also as in a role that I'm in now for applicator training. And I may pull from experience as well as being a pesticide applicator as well. So go ahead, next slide, Vanya. And I'll say as well, I did provide some resources. There are several things great things that Rob brought up, and I did. One thing the Pesticide Bureau doesn't do is really advise a lot on what to do. So Rob had some great comments there. I wanted to provide something for the people on this call today. So there was a resource I sent out to Vanya, which was a North Central IPM Institute resource on what to do if drift happens. And I thought that was a pretty thorough piece and gave some good information and a lot of what Rob talked about. Second was a list of private labs. So Rob also talked about private labs as well. And he did his own testing. And so I provided a list of those labs that may help people out. And then I also provided as a resource our Pesticide Bureau investigation and enforcement brochure. And that has some of the information I'll talk about again today. But I want to share some good news here from as I can. And one thing is just talk about what's going on at the Pesticide Bureau. I think that's a strong point, especially for the state of Iowa. We are currently fully staffed in our department and in our office. We've got a full staff of 8 pesticide investigators in the field. 2 are newer. 7 of those investigators are credentialed. And when I say credentialed, that's an important thing. That means they've been through their training programs, the EPA training, the on-the-job training, and they are allowed to go out and conduct those investigations and inspections on their own. Up until that point, they work with another investigator through that on-the-job training. So 7 of our 8 field investigators right now are credentialed as well as myself. I carry my credentials yet. So the other thing I would point out there too is we have a very good mix in our staff of investigators of ones that are, let's say, seasoned. They've been around a few years. We have some new staff members as well, but they carry a lot of great experience in ag, in different jobs. One spent really a career in the co-op system and understands the industry. So these are not easy jobs to hire for, and there is an enormous amount of training that goes into it. So it is with a really great amount of pleasure that I can say we are fully staffed and we've got a great group of people. We've added a case review officer, and I'll talk more about where that comes in, but that's allowed us, as some of these investigations have ramped up in numbers the last few years, it's helping us work through a backlog of cases. We do have one that will be retiring here shortly, and most of our turnover that we have had has been due to retirements. And so that's a good thing as well. So it provides for the state of Iowa and the customers that we serve, the residents that we serve, there's a lot of stability and a constant in our department that we're able to do the jobs that we need to do. And so this is good news, I really feel like. So next slide, please. As far as where our authority comes from, basically it all comes from the federal level under FIFRA, the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. And EPA hands down basically that responsibility for much of what we do to the state lead agencies, which is the Department of Agriculture in Iowa. So we work under a cooperative agreement under the EPA to respond to pesticide inquiries, concerns, tips, complaints, among other things. And basically a lot of our rules, code, laws, and things are rooted in that that federal law. We have to meet or exceed in all those cases what the federal law is. So Iowa Chapter 206 covers a lot of pesticides, and a lot of what I'll talk about today comes down to that code section that says it should be unlawful for any person to use or cause to be used any pesticide contrary to its labeling or the rules of the state of Iowa if those rules differ from or further restrict usage. So next slide, please. And just briefly, just to talk about some of the other things that we do, there's a list there. I'm not going to go into them for the sake of time, but like I said, that investigation piece, if you hit the space bar, it'll kind of highlight that. But that'll be what I focus on here today. And you can do the next slide, Vanya. So investigation and enforcement calls, I kind of wanted to go over really some of the things that we hear about. What are the calls? What are the types of calls that we get? And if you just kind of hit the space bar, Vanya, it'll bring up a list here. So of course, the alleged drift, overspray, or application in high winds, that's certainly the one we're going to talk about, focus on today. Could be tank contamination. So sometimes we're out in the field, maybe it wasn't a drift incident. Maybe the person that was hired to spray, if there's people on the calls that maybe they're conventional farmers, and something else was in a previous tank, or something else was mixed incorrectly in a tank, we can have tank contamination issues. Rob alluded to a little bit too, other ways besides drift. Certainly if there's a pesticide application that comes too close to a rain, or the field's at field capacity for what it can hold, there's certainly a potential for that pesticide to run off the site of application and onto a neighboring field or a sensitive area. Human and animal contact, and again, Rob, appreciate you talking about that. And again, I hate to hear when this happens. If this does, this is certainly our priority when we get these type of calls into the park department. If there's a human contact, we will prioritize investigations, responses, things like that. We are not an emergency service, but when we get those calls about human contact, they do take precedence. Feed, food, water contamination. Again, these may be calls, again, if it's a food contamination, or if we have someone who's an organic farmer and there's time sensitivities with selling a crop, harvesting a crop, much what Rob alluded to, we will again try to prioritize these over certain other types of cases. So we do that in any chance that we can, and try to in those situations give as quick of an answer that we can, although I would never characterize what we do as quick. We're more concerned about doing it correctly and documenting and making sure that we're following our quality processes, so that if a case were to go to court, we have all of our ducks in a row. Our I's are dotted, our T's are crossed. We followed our procedures, and our samples are good quality samples, without, hopefully never come into a question if it would go to court. Go ahead. Certainly we get calls, pollinator concerns, and those do tend to kind of coincide, especially with those aerial applications, and just kind of keep clicking through. We'll get calls too from other companies. They'll turn in applicators not wearing their personal protective equipment. Certainly when we talk about turf companies, they like to turn each other in if they know somebody's not licensed or an applicator isn't certified. And some people may find those as well. We do have a link on our website where you can check to see if a company is currently licensed or an applicator is currently certified. So some people may look that up and realize that the company that knocked on their door is not licensed, and they'll give us a call, and that'll come in as a concern, and we'll follow up with those. Somebody sprays the wrong address. Again, in town, this happens quite a bit. This can also happen in the ag side as well. Certainly there's times when maybe the wrong field gets sprayed. And then also, again, when we talk about urban areas, notification, pre-notification, where those are required, we'll get calls on those. So next slide, please. So just briefly to talk about, Rob touched on it too, pesticide drift. What is it? So pesticide spray drift, and this is as the Iowa Corps manual defines this, is movement of pesticides through the air to non-target areas, either as a solid, a liquid, or a vapor. Next slide. And Rob also mentioned vapor drift, and that's one I'll touch on more. But again, what is that? That is a gaseous vapor from the target area, volatilized pesticides. You know, this has been in the news a lot. I think the last 6 years, and the volatilities. And again, in the manual, it talks about those pesticides that may turn to may vaporize. They certainly can travel farther for longer periods of time than a physical spray drift. So that's certainly of concern. Next slide. So what have we seen? Just to give kind of a snapshot of what's happened. This goes back 11 years. Certainly you can see through 2012 through 2016, we were pretty stable as far as the number of pesticide misuse calls that we got. And then it's divided down, if you look at the third and fourth columns, into the ag calls versus non-ag calls. So around 100 calls a year. Certainly in 2017, you start to notice that change. And if you hit forward, it'll put some animation in here, Vanya. So that's where we saw, really this uptick, and we're talking about a double in the number of cases that we got. That, of course, coincided, it's no secret at this point, to the introduction of dicamba-tolerant soybeans and over-the-top applications. And this was something that wasn't just unique to Iowa. Also, you're talking about cotton, and especially in areas where there's cotton and soybeans next to each other. Arkansas, Missouri, very southern part of Missouri. I think our numbers kind of dwarf, or their numbers would dwarf what we saw. I think Arkansas had 400 or 500 calls a year. And so, but they all kind of coincided, and you can see what's happened from 2017 through 2022. And if you keep hitting forward, Vanya, just wanted to keep talking a little bit about dicamba when that hit the market. Certainly there's some things, and you can keep going, Vanya, on those labels that were new to applicators. They were required to keep additional records. They were required to take annual training. All of a sudden there's required buffers, there's wind restrictions, additives, drift reduction agents, followed later on by requiring to have volatility reduction agents. You can only use approved tank mixes, and you can keep going, Vanya. There's more of these. Start talking about a lot of things on a pesticide label. That you could only use approved spray tips. You're required to do a sensitive crop survey, and I'll talk more where that's important for this group and how you can communicate that if you don't know already. We started out with cutoff dates on dicamba, June 30th. And if you keep going, Ronnie, I've got more here. Followed with lawsuits. Labels were vacated, I believe it was 2020 by Ninth Circuit Court. That was followed up pretty soon after with new federal labels that approved 3 of those 4 products, dicamba products for over-the-top use in soybeans with a 5-year label. And go ahead and go forward again, Bunny. I think this is the last one in 2022. Again, you can look at the numbers, June 20th cutoff date, and we still had, really pretty high levels of misuse calls or calls concerning phenoxy type herbicides that were coming in. And I'll point out too, these dates in this chart, we do put these online. These were current as of February 13th. These numbers do change all the time as we go through and verify in the cases that are reviewed. These numbers will change as we verify if it was phenoxy herbicide that was involved. These were, kind of moved a little bit. So this is not a stagnant number, but these are current as of February of this year. So next slide. So again, I want to give some good news. 2023, we did get a cutoff date of June 12th in the I states, Iowa, Illinois, Indiana. That was done on the federal label. So this was not done necessarily by the states. This was the manufacturer who enacted these cutoff dates on the federal label. And next slide. So I wanted to show what was happening in the last 3 years. Obviously, 2022, we had a record year again. If you look here, the blue line is 2023. The orange line is 2022, and the gray line was 2021. And this is not every day that these are entered, but this is the number of calls that came into our department by date. Dates are at the bottom that were reporting concern of a phenoxy or dicamba, 2,4-D, that type of product. So these, at this point when they're reported, these are not confirmed whether it actually was a dicamba drift or a 2,4-D drift or something of the sort, but it gives you an idea of when we had these cutoff dates, when the calls would come in. It usually takes between about 10 or 14 days if there is a dicamba drift to show symptomology in a sensitive crop, especially soybeans. So it's a delayed response. So when we have those cutoff dates of June 30th, about 14 days later, 10 to 14 days later, if they sprayed right up to there, we would get this huge increase in calls, 50, 100 calls that would continue on through July and then start to level off in August. What we saw this year, and this was noticeable during that time frame. I hear almost every call that comes in here, and it was really a noticeable difference this year that we had a very, very steep drop off in the number of calls coming in that were claiming a phenoxy drift or concern. And so that was good news. I know it doesn't help everybody, but at least this year, things were trending in a much better direction. I wouldn't go in a lot to say why that happens. I don't have the numbers to support that, but certainly I think there's been some moves away from the technology. There's been, I'm sure, some commercial entities that maybe refuse to spray it anymore. And so there may be a number of reasons for this, maybe possibly more corn acres, less soybean acres. But again, I don't have the numbers to show that, but noticeable difference here. We're talking about number of calls coming in. Next slide. Let's just go through and keep clicking here. It'll bring up some lists. So, who has the potential to minimize drift? Really what it comes down to, there's a lot of ways to do that, and you keep clicking. What we focus on at the Department of Ag with the Pesticide Bureau is we follow up with the applicator. And if you keep going there, Vanya, it'll get down to where you get to applicator, and then we can go to the next slide. But certainly all these people on this list or entities, there are ways that they can affect pesticide drift from better equipment, better technologies, the person making the decisions on what to spray, growers, neighbors, politicians, EPA, certainly lawyers that talked about lawsuits to vacate products. Those things are happening every day. So it's a long list, but really who we follow up with when we're doing an incident report and an investigation, we follow up with that applicator. That's the person who's at the end of the line. That's the person making the decision whether to spray, whether not to spray. Next slide. And just very briefly, factors that influence drift. The first three really are key. So the applicator is the person that kind of has control over this. So they're setting up that equipment. Certainly they need to be looking at their tip charts, following the labels, but droplet size, wind direction, and wind speed are the three biggest factors that influence pesticide drift. So as Rob was saying, if you're seeing an application and you notice the wind speed on that day was 20 miles an hour with 30-mile-an-hour gusts, certainly those are things to take note of. And at that point, we get those calls too every spring. Previous to someone saying that there was drift, they will call in those applications knowing that they were most likely off-label. Okay. Everything below that is just other things that may affect drifts, spray boom height, pressure, speed, volume. Some of these things are dictated on labels, topography, structures, weather, spray buffers. Some of those things now are on pesticide labels like the dicamba. Over the top for soybeans have required buffers. And then additives, again, there's a lot of label language anymore in some of these labels that applicators need to adhere to. Next slide. So some of the things, and we can keep clicking through here, we're not just responding to these incidents, but IDALS there's things up front, so there's things in code that help to hopefully stop this to some extent before it happens. Certainly, people making pesticide recommendations need to be making those according to label, or the company's held liable for the employees that are making those recommendations that are contrary to label. We also require commercial applicators to be licensed. So this would be the business that's applying the pesticides. Next slide. And keep clicking. Yep. So we require those businesses that want to do commercial applications have to have evidence of financial responsibility. They have to have that on file before we'll issue that commercial applicator business license. And then when we talk about restricted use pesticides, we talk about applicator certifications. In Iowa, we are a little bit different than other states and even surrounding states. We require all commercial applicators, with very few exceptions, to be certified, whether it's a restricted use product or a general use product. So the state of Iowa has gone a little bit farther than some other states. Next slide. Again, certification requirements. To be initially certified as an applicator, we've got testing programs that they have to commercial applicators have to go through core exam and category exams and prove a minimum amount of competency or understanding before they should be applying pesticides. We also require that, you can go to the next slide, for private applicators using restricted use pesticides. That's when that requirement comes in for private applicators in Iowa would need that certification as well prior to purchase from the retailer. And the labels, a lot of times will say for application, only buy a certified applicator. In some instances, it may allow, and state code may allow, for supervision by a certified applicator. But like I said, most instances, especially when we're talking RUPs, that applicator has to be certified. And on the commercial side, that business has to be licensed, has to have financial responsibility on file. Already talked on human animal contact. The point to make here is if that happens, you should first seek medical help. Or in case of animals, if you've got animals that are showing signs and symptoms of some sort of pesticide incident, certainly contact a veterinarian. Those are not things that we can really advise on or help you with. That's the first step. Seek the help that you need to, then give us a call. Okay, next slide. Incident reporting, and I'm not going to go through all this. The key things here is this is time sensitive. And so we want to have these calls within 60 days of the alleged incident, or before 25% of the crop has been harvested, which everyone is kind of sooner. And the reason for this is that our goal is when we do an investigation is to collect that evidence that either proves or disproves compliance with the label of the law. If that evidence is washed away or has been broken down by the plant, where we can't find whether there's a pesticide residue anymore, really, we can't. There's not much we can do. We can go to a records inspection and see what we can find that may be non-compliant there, but the samples certainly help to back up whether or not something happens. So time sensitive, give us a call. You may not call right away. And in Rob's case, this happened late on a Friday night. There's not somebody here to take that call. So it may be delayed by several days. Some people may kind of take a week or two before they decide whether to call us or not. And in other instances, like I mentioned with, say, in an instance with dicamba, it may be a delayed response. So you may not know for a couple of weeks that a drift incident may have occurred. So in the case of dicamba, I would make another statement here. At 45 days, if we have not taken samples by that point, 45 days out from that application, we can almost guarantee that we are not going to find a residue. That particular product is broken down fairly quickly. There may still be signs and symptoms that are visible, but to get a residue on a vegetation sample or things of those sorts, we know at 45 days that the chance of that goes down dramatically. And likely at that point, we will go to what's called a modified misuse investigation, collect records and no samples, and we'll follow up with whatever compliance or non-compliance issues there might be in the record. Okay, but we're not going to have those samples to help back up any claims. And we need basic information too. So Rob says, we understand when people call. I was upset when I called. I know Rob was upset when he called. Most everyone is. We understand that. But Rob, I appreciate the comments of practice some civility. The person that's taking that call here is not conducting the investigation. They are just trying to get basic information so that we can get back in touch with you. And then a brief description of the incident. So next slide. How am I doing on time, Vanya?
Sorry, about 5 minutes.
Okay. So what happens once we receive the call, that incident report's taken by that person that takes the call. It's then reviewed by the bureau chief, assigned a case number, a case type, and that information is then emailed out to the investigator. The investigator will make contact with the complainant and then also or the applicators. Again, I want to stress this isn't an emergency service. We get out there as quickly as we can. In most cases, our goal is to get out and at least collect those samples within 5 days of the call, so that we can preserve that evidence. And like I said, there may be cases where we we'll bump some calls ahead of others, human contact, those sort of things. Next slide. All that goes through kind of a process, and you can go to the next slide. I'll keep going through and you can click through, but the investigator is going to make contact with the complainant. They're going to collect that information. They're going to take affidavits from the person that filed the complaint. They're going to take photographs. We're going to document what we see on the day that we're there as best we can. If it's determined we take samples, we'll take those samples. Again, everything is done according to protocols so that we can ensure that those samples are valid and they don't come into question later on. So we follow a process, and you keep clicking through. We'll follow up then with, like I said, the applicators, the companies involved. We'll collect application records. It may be sales reports, anything we can to give us facts of what happened. Really what we're there to do is to collect as many facts we can of what happened that can help us determine whether there was non-compliance with the label of the law. And after that, the applicator, the investigator compiles the reports That includes the incident reports, the narratives, the use investigation reports, and what the applications were. They'll draw up maps that'll show where samples were taken. And then there'll be, if there's lab results, there'll be lab results that come out. I usually told people up front that that would be the first thing that they would get in response to when they made a report to us, is that that lab sample report will go out to the complainant, the company, and the applicator, and also be copied to people here. That'll give you an indication then whether we found that residue to help support that drift claim. Go ahead and keep clicking. And keep going through. After that, it goes through a case review process, and there's multiple levels of that can come from that. Once that case is reviewed, it's reviewed by the case review officer. The case is never reviewed by the investigator. We try to do this every step of the way. That IDOLS is an unbiased party in this. So we collect facts. We don't interject opinions. And in the end, we take what facts that we can prove, and that goes into the disposition letter again. And that may be dismissals. There could be official notices that were given out by the investigator. Certainly there's warning letters, and we can get up to civil penalties, referral to the EPA, and license suspension, revocation. Go ahead and go through. Next slide. So this is just an example of one. Go ahead and click to the next slide. And maybe that was familiar to people that have vegetables. This was a slide of where this happened, and this is pretty straightforward case. You can kind of notice on the left-hand side that garden is just on the other side of that grape trellis. So an application to that cornfield, you can actually see in the grass where it's kind of yellowed, where the wind likely picked up and drifted that application over into the turf areas. Next slide. So on that complaint, the complainant called in, reported the wind is southwest is 18 to 25 miles an hour, stronger gusts. The applicator, of course, reported 74 degrees, southwest wind at 11 miles per hour. What we do in those instances is we compare that to, we pull our own state report. Climatologist here pulls a report for the area, the time of the application, and as part of our case file, we include that climatologist report set for that area at that time. Winds were southwest at 13 with gusts up to 23. So next slide.
We have about 30 seconds left.
Okay. This is just one, again, I wanted to share when we talk about dicamba, and certainly Rob talked about the instances where we may not be able to figure out who sprayed and caused signs and symptoms that somebody sees. This is just a diagram I put together, but if you look at that yellow field in the middle, that this was very common that I would go out on an investigation. There's an illicit soybean field. To the south, there was a cornfield sprayed with status, which is dicamba. Maybe there were dicamba beans on 2 other sides, 3 other sides. In those instances, it may be more than one source. It could be every source where we got dicamba. And a point to make is when we take samples, there's no way for us to determine dicamba in one application from another application. So this is where it gets really complicated. And where the department follows up is what is non-compliant in those applications. And so those letters that come out in the end don't point to who's at fault for the signs and symptoms. We point out non-compliance with the label and the law. Okay. And I can stop there, but again, I wanted to point out there's some other resources that I included, and that's available for everybody at the end.
All right. Thank you, Mark. I have to. Hang on. We're gonna go there. Thank you, Mark. We almost made it. And again, any questions can be put in the chat, and then we'll get to that in a minute. Our next speaker for today is Karen Varley, and I will let her introduce herself. So all you, Karen.
Thank you, Vanya. Hello, everyone. I'm Karen Varley, and I am pleased to be part of this panel today addressing drift issues. I practice law with my husband, Warren Varley, in Stewart, Iowa, which is a wonderful town of 1,800 good eggs and a few stinkers. We have a transactional practice, which means we rarely get into court. Our focus is on helping our clients avoid legal issues in the first place. Next slide, please. A couple of disclaimers today. I want to mention that I am licensed to practice law only in Iowa, so my comments will reflect Iowa law. Second, what I will discuss today is general in nature. It's not intended to be legal advice for your specific situation, for which you should contact your own attorney. And there's no attorney-client relationship established by our discussion today. Next slide, please. Here's an overview of what I want to talk about. Two general buckets of topics. The first, which will be the bulk of the time, will focus on that practical guidance. I'll look at 3 legal options available to you as a victim of spray drift, and also touch on the questions of how and when to involve an attorney. Secondly, towards the end, I want to spend a few minutes on taking a bigger picture view, looking at how we got into this situation with the problems of spray drift, whether there are things we can do within the existing legal and regulatory framework that could help us better address the problems. Next slide. I want to start by reinforcing what both Mark and Rob have told us. There are things that IDALS, the Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship, will help with, and those include the list here. The investigators will help to identify the parties involved. They'll take sworn statements from the persons involved, collect those soil and plant samples as appropriate, and then provide the lab results to the complainant and the other parties. After the full investigation is completed, they'll determine what penalty, if any, should be applied. And we saw during the break, there was a slide put up that Mark had provided showing a distribution of the types of penalties, which was interesting. I had not seen that before. Next slide. On the other hand, IDALS is not involved in helping you calculate your losses, nor does IDALS help seek compensation for those losses. That's a completely separate system, and that's what I'll be walking you through today. Next slide. The basis for legal rights and responsibilities come from several places. First, in Iowa, the legislature enacts laws which are codified in the Iowa Code, and Chapter 206 is the Pesticide Act of Iowa, so that's a good place to start for the high-level regulation. Then the agency tasked with implementing these laws is the Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship. They go through rulemaking processes and put in place specific regulations, which are, in this case, in Chapter 45 for pesticides. Also not on the slide, but another aspect of the legal world is case law. So those are any judicial determinations as to pesticide use and misuse. We'll, in fact, talk about that a bit later. Next slide. So I've put in here what I see as 3 routes that you might take to pursue compensation for damages when drift occurs. The first is to talk it out. The second option is to pursue a claim through the applicator's insurance. And the third is to file suit. These approaches are not necessarily mutually exclusive. You may find that you want to start with one, and depending on the level of satisfaction, might choose to move to a different one. Next slide. There are some elements which are common to all three options. First, as has been mentioned by both Rob and Mark, it's very important to provide documentation. The more documentation, the better. Those notes that are taken on the day of the incident regarding the weather, photographs of the stage of the crop, and the condition of the crop on that day, the next week, and probably every week throughout the growing season. You'll also be advised to take your own plant and soil samples right along with the investigator from IDALS. Take them in the same place at the same time so that you have the opportunity for a separate independent analysis if you wish to pursue that. Also, as Rob mentioned, preserving clothing of a person who may have been exposed to pesticide drift. I apologize for the telephone. A second element common to all of these approaches is to be mindful of the timelines. Any request to initiate an investigation by IDALS has to be made within 60 days of the incident. If you are in a position of pursuing civil litigation, there is a statutory limit that sets the window for when you can start a case. If you're looking at a personal injury situation, it's a 2-year window. If it's damage to property, it's up to 5 years. Please don't wait until the last minute, because the sooner you take action, the better. Next slide, please. Let's look a little more closely now at that first option that I call talk it out. What are the factors and what kind of scenario would you have where this would be appropriate? I think the first factor is to consider a relationship with the applicator. Sometimes it's an anonymous company, but it also might be a neighbor with whom your family has had a relationship for decades. And that may be an important thing to maintain and to consider. It could be, in fact, a family member. Second, is this the first incident, or does it seem to be a recurring pattern? Third, what is the extent of the damage? If it's minimal, it may be more appropriate to resolve it in this way, in kind of a low-key manner. Then think about whether, if you are going to talk it out, can it be casual? Does it need to be more formal? Do you need to involve a third party, perhaps to mediate or simply to facilitate the discussion? And finally, if this results in an agreement, you might consider whether that needs to be written down and perhaps contain a plan for going forward. Next slide. Option 2 is to file a claim against the applicator's insurance. As Mark mentioned, to be certified in Iowa, the applicant must provide proof of financial responsibility. And often this is insurance. The minimum coverage in Iowa is $100,000 per occurrence and $300,000 per year. So we'll know that any certified applicator needs to have that financial responsibility. You may not know who the insurance is provided through, what company, but IDALS will have this information on file, and that's another way that they can help you. You would then contact that insurance company to make your complaint. At this point, I would recommend that you provide them with the sworn statement that you gave to the IDALS investigator. It's already a matter of public record, and it helps you to be consistent in your story. You could also, if you have the lab results by this point, you could provide them as part of your complaint. The insurance company will likely send out their own investigator and/or adjuster to meet with you, and you'll want to do that and be civil, as has been mentioned a couple of times. Next slide. In the process of determining whether there's compensation to be received from the insurance company, there's really two phases of the process. The first is liability, determining who is at fault. And the second phase will be damages, which is the legal term for the compensation to which you're entitled as a result of your losses. Next slide. After filing the complaint, you'll probably get some kind of response from the insurance company, and don't be surprised to see something like this. You should have left a buffer zone on your side of the fence. Or you have lots of land, you could have planted your crop somewhere else where it would have been less vulnerable. Or perhaps the insurance company has conducted their own analysis of the samples. They have found a product that you use on your crops, and they'll allege that it was your spraying that caused the damage. These are variations of blame the victim, or you assumed the risk. So you'll need to work through these and use the facts in your situation to establish where the liability truly lies. Next slide. Once you're past the liability phase, then we're into determining damages. How much do you need to be made whole, to be put back where you were before this incident happened? If you're working with an insurance adjuster who's most familiar with commodity crops, it may be helpful to put your losses in those relative terms. For example, this half acre of vegetable production annually produces or generates as much revenue as 40 acres of field corn. Now, you can't just pull a number out of the air. It's important to have good records. And hopefully, as a business person, you've been keeping those records each year, because I would expect to be asked for 3 to 5 years of production records and/or sales records. Remember, when you're negotiating where you want to end up, you can always come down, but it's very difficult to move your number up. If you do happen to receive a check in an attempt to settle, and it's not enough, it's not sufficient, I recommend you don't cash it, because if you do so, that could be interpreted as accepting that as a settlement. Next slide. Our third option is litigation, and that is filing a suit in the district court. As I mentioned, we're not litigators. I don't do litigation, so I'm just talking about this in general terms today. The most likely grounds for your suit would be negligence or nuisance. The applicator was negligent, was not compliant with laws, and this resulted in the damage. Every case is going to be unique, and this is where your attorney will help you gather the evidence and determine what legal principles best apply to your case. In terms of remedies, there's two general types. The first is a monetary award. Within the category of monetary award, there could be compensatory or punitive damages, or both. Compensatory damages reflect your losses, your crop loss, your production loss. It could include such things as the harm to your reputation as a supplier. If Fairway has been counting on you to bring in your product every summer and now you don't have it, that's a business loss as well. There can also be expenses for medical treatment for you or your employees, and that increased work. I thought that was a good point Rob made, that there's work that is associated with recovering from the incident itself. There could, in terms of medical, I want to mention not just physical, but also emotional and mental and all types of injury and trauma that could result. So those are the compensatory damages. And then punitive monetary damages are intended as a punishment to prevent future similar behavior. The second category of remedies is an injunction. An injunction is a ruling by a judge which prohibits or requires a certain type of action from the defendant. I am pleased to tell you about a recent Court of Appeals decision here in Iowa, which upheld an injunction that was issued in a Clayton County case. There, an organic farm was impacted by spray drift from the neighboring farm. The organic farm filed suit and a jury awarded damages. In addition, the judge issued an injunction that whenever the neighbors are going to spray, they must give the organic farm written notice by email or text at least 1 hour before they do the spraying. As I said, this was upheld in the Iowa Court of Appeals in April of this year. Next slide. A couple of other provisions of Iowa law that I just want to mention here. The first, the 717A.3, is a provision that covers a situation where there's deliberate, willful damage to a crop. And if that willfulness can be proven, then the plaintiff is entitled to 3 times their actual damages, as well as recovery of court costs and attorney fees. The second statute mentioned there is a failure to assist, which is actually a criminal statute. If a person sees that someone else is in imminent danger of harm, they have an obligation to contact law enforcement or emergency services. As I said, that's a criminal statute, but it might be in a particularly egregious situation, it might be something to pursue. Next slide. Here I want to turn to the question of when and how to involve an attorney to help you. The first question, well, let me say this could happen at any of those 3 options: involving somebody to help you talk it out, helping with a claim against the insurance, or of course, filing suit. The first place to start would be with referrals from people you know or professionals you know. Someone who's had a good experience or bad, find out what they think. Another option here in Iowa is to go to the website of the Iowa Bar Association. There's a page on there called Find a Lawyer. Every lawyer who chooses to be listed there has promised to charge no more than $25 for the first 30-minute consultation. So you can contact an attorney and talk about your case and see if you're a good fit for each other. At that search page, you can delimit by county, by city, and by subject matter. So you might put in your county and agricultural law to help you find somebody who has indicated they would like to work on this type of case. In that initial interview, it'll be a 2-way evaluation. They'll be considering whether this is something that they want to take on as a case, and you'll be looking at the attorney to see if it's someone that you respect and trust and feel that you can work with. Second, how much would the cost be if you decide to go forward? Generally, attorneys will work on either an hourly rate or as a contingency fee. Hourly rate is what it sounds like. A contingency fee means that the attorney only gets paid if you get paid. And generally it's a percentage. So I think we're on the next slide. The percentage is going to vary from firm to firm, but just as an example, if you agree to a 20% contingency fee and your recovery is $50,000, then $10,000 goes to the attorney and $40,000 to you. In any case, whatever the agreement and arrangements are, I would ask for an engagement agreement. This spells out the terms of the contract between you and the attorney so that you have a mutual understanding of the expectations. Also, I would urge you to reach out to an attorney sooner rather than later. This helps you to avoid any missteps, and it is helpful to stay in tune with those limitations, those statute of limitations, so that you're pursuing your case in a timely way. Next slide. Okay, we've talked through those elements in the practical guidance, which I believe is, we've got 10 minutes to go. Good, thank you, Vanya. That's exactly where I wanted to be. We'll spend the last few minutes here looking at what are some of the issues in the system. It's not the focus today, but I've noticed a lot of comments in the chat about certain aspects of our system. As a transactional lawyer, we're always looking for creative solutions within the existing legal framework. And with respect to pesticide drift, there may be some things that we can do a little better. Next slide. It's important to look at this because spray drift really is a problem across the board. It's a headache for the applicators themselves. I believe that most are acting in good faith. They're going out there trying to comply. They're not really intending to be a problem for their neighbors. It's also a concern for the insurance carriers who are seeing more claims, more costly claims. This impacts their bottom line. And of course, it's devastating for specialty and organic crop producers when it happens. Also not shown on the slide, but there are health impacts on people who aren't even in agriculture. They're rural residents. They happen to be outside. They happen to be hanging out their laundry or going for a walk and their pets are outside. It's a concern for the public. I want to reinforce what Vanya said up front, that Practical Farmers of Iowa is not an advocacy organization, not involved in setting policy. If these are issues that are important to you, you may want to reach out to Farmers Union, for example, and Iowa Farmers Union is on the call today. Another entity would be the Pesticide Action Network. Next slide, please. I'd like to start with looking at funding for Iowa. In 1987, the Iowa legislature passed a law which required registration of all pesticide products used in the state. There was a fee attached to the registration, and $50 of the fee was to go towards pesticide enforcement. It was $50 in 1987, and it's $50 today, even though inflation alone would suggest that it should be approximately $135. During those 35 years, we've seen an increase in the number and type of products, in the number of acres treated, in the number of acres treated with multiple products, and the complexity of agriculture in Iowa in general. So there's more demand for the services that IDALS provides and that Mark described so well. The fee, as I said, the $50 was for pesticide enforcement. The total fee under the 1987 law had a cap of $3,000, and this was based on a sliding scale reflecting retail sales. In 2022, the legislature did away with the $3,000 cap and made it a flat fee of $300. The Legislative Service Bureau did an analysis, but it was inconclusive as to how this would affect funding. So it'd be something to watch going forward. The second item here on the slide is the level of transparency of regulation. There is a pesticide advisory committee set up in that same 1987 law, with 7 scientists, including people such as the dean of the vet school, the dean of the University of Iowa Medical School, entomologists, horticulturalists, other experts, and 2 members of the general public. I think this is great, super. We have a committee to advise the Secretary of Agriculture, but it's very difficult to get any information about this committee, when they meet, what they talk about, and how to have some input. Similarly, there are 2 peer review panels for private applicators and commercial applicators. And it's hard to know who they are. Who are these people? How can we get involved? How can we have some input? So I think we could do better about making those public records. Secondly, is the release of findings after an investigation. As a complainant, say an incident has occurred and I file a complaint, I will get a copy of the final resolution, which could be 12 to 18 months after the incident, or perhaps longer. That's helpful, and I think it's appropriate that the complainant does receive that. However, the entire file that is compiled by IDALS during the investigation is not made available unless I, as a complainant, request it. And then it's only available in paper form, and I have to pay for it, which could be, in some circumstances that I've seen, over $100. This might be something that we could do better at. Next slide, please. In terms of the complexity of agriculture in Iowa, this is a real win. I'm glad Mark mentioned it. I'm so pleased that it's worked, that we have this sensitive crop registry where producers can list their operations. This puts applicators on notice that they need to be aware there are vulnerable crops or apiaries in their vicinity. The downside is that it's a one-way communication. It's up to the producer to put this out there, and there's no reciprocation from the applicators. My suggestion would be that we consider some sort of notification. Next slide, please. And we could start perhaps with aerial application, which by its nature is more likely to result in off-target application. If we had such advanced notification, it would be helpful not only to the producers, but to others out in the public. I've experienced driving along the interstate and been highly distracted by a spray plane. If there were notification, it might make driving safer. We could have a system where we opt in based on a limited geographic region. And the good news is that there already is a system that exists for which this could be used. Next slide. This is the Alert Iowa messaging system, which is used for public safety messages and severe weather alerts. 91 of 99 counties already participate. And perhaps it could be useful for that advanced notification. We've already seen a judge rule that it's not burdensome to provide advanced notification. Next slide. Other possibilities would be a crop insurance against drift, which doesn't, to my knowledge, exist at this point, and a database of drift incidents to help raise awareness and work towards solutions for everyone. There may be some private information concerns, but that can be addressed. Next slide. That concludes my discussion this afternoon of practical guidance in response to a drift incident, and then some possibilities for future work to improve our system. Thanks to all for listening.
Thank you, Karen. And just in time, perfect. Thank you so much. All right. With that, we are going to go into a 30-minute Q&A. I have seen questions popping up in the chat as we've had our first 3 speakers. So feel free to add any new questions that you may have. I'm going to start with some of the first ones that were asked, and this Karen, Rob, Mark, and Emily later on. This might pertain to you, any one of these questions. So, all right, going back up to the top. How can you find out what was sprayed on your land, or is there anyone to ask for that?
Vanya, I can touch on that. So the law as it currently is, there's the requirement is if there's an agent of the Secretary of Ag that requests the record, they're required to give that to us, and also medical professionals. So if there's a medical incident, but to my knowledge, there's not a requirement. When you get into urban settings, there's different rules, or within a municipality. But for agricultural, it can be requested by the department or medical professionals.
Okay. Thank you.
And that's part of an investigation that of course then is public information. So we're happy to provide what we find.
All right. This next one can go to Rob or Emily. Just really briefly, can you address what the Pesticide Action Network does for those who might want to seek advice from you later on after our program here?
All right, I'll take that. So the question is what Pesticide Action Network does. I was going to defer to Emily because Emily's been working with Pesticide Action Network longer than I have, but I can't hide underneath the I'm new anymore because I've actually worked with PAN for 3 years. So we do a number of things. PAN is actually one of 5 organizations. It's an international organization. So we've got a PAN Europe and a PAN AP, Asia Pacific, and we're PAN North America. And we have people who work on international, national, and state level campaigns, including Iowa, Minnesota, Hawaii, and California. We're very interested in trying to reduce reliance on pesticides in our food and ag system, and we're trying to promote alternatives such as agroecology, which does not rely on a chemical intensive system. That's a lot of what we end up doing is we try to promote those things. We have a grassroots science department that does a lot with, as was mentioned in the chat, they have done, for example, pesticide drift catchers in the past. We have various other grassroots science projects that have happened over the years. If you go to our website, you'll find we have resources with numerous reports with lots of good scientific research behind them. And we do try to advocate at both the federal and state levels for changes in policy. So while PFI is maybe not a policy organization, PAN would be a policy organization. So if you want to see some change, that's where you might want to go. Emily, anything to add on that?
No, I think you did a really beautiful job, Rob, and I should have written it down because my answer gets long. Thank you.
All right, thank you. This next one is addressed to Mark. It says, I'd appreciate your stance on using the labels REI to determine how long to stay away as a bystander, and the PHI to determine how long before you can eat or sell your product after a drift incident.
We get unmuted here. Yeah, so the restricted entry interval is on that label for early entry of workers into an area that's been sprayed. We're going to, the Department of Ag is going to state what's on the label. And in Rob's, I would use Rob's situation as an example where he had work that he needed to get done to decontaminate supplies. He had other workers there. What I would say is follow what's on the label. You're allowed to re-enter that area if you have the proper personal protective equipment. So we would tell you, make sure you're wearing the proper equipment. not to enter without that during that REI when it's in effect. As far as the pre-harvest interval, that's a little harder question to answer because pre-harvest interval is going to state for on a label of what that interval is for a product that is labeled on. So if there's a product that's labeled on green beans, then there's, you know, it's going to have a certain number of days that you have to wait before you can harvest. In a drift incident, it may not be a product that's labeled on that crop. And so a pre-harvest interval may not be effective or may not be correct. It's only for the product that is labeled on or the crop that's labeled on. So sometimes there's information that you may be able to get, NPIC, NPIC. I think there's some information I included on that. They may be able to help with some of that info. But if it's not a crop that the product would have been labeled on, we can't really give an answer on that.
Okay. Thank you, Mark. Let's see. Sorry, I'm having to scroll through questions here. All right. I didn't know about the Pesticide Bureau last year when an aerial spray plane had a malfunctioning nozzle and my 7.5 acres were sprayed with Bravo fungicide. Is it too late to report?
Yep, I'll go back to that 60 days before 25% of the crop has been harvested. A year later, we are not going to be able to prove that. The only way we could prove that that happens if we had residues on the crop. So more than likely, it's going to be too late to prove that it was actually an off-target application. It depends. There may be certain instances that are reported later on we can assign out as a records inspection, but a malfunction of equipment is going to be something we couldn't prove a year later in most cases.
I'd like to jump in and say that the timeline is passed for the IDOLS investigation, but that doesn't rule out other legal options.
And I'll add one more thing, just a reminder that the longer you wait, the harder it is to get any pesticide residue testing. And if you have a rain event in between your test and the application, often that will reduce the pesticide residue that you can find. So you got to keep all those things in mind, but that doesn't mean you still shouldn't try to pursue an action if you have some evidence, because something did happen.
Yep, and I would add too, you know, from Department of Ag standpoint, we are trying to prove non-compliance with the label of the law, and I agree with that there may be other avenues just from our standpoint that burden of proof to prove that there was a malfunction in equipment without a residue sample is extremely difficult to do.
Okay. Let's see here. And this question kind of ties in a little bit with some of that timing. I've heard there are dates that certain, hang on. I've heard there are dates, certain seasons in which some chemicals cannot be sprayed. Who sets these dates during each season? And are there dates for each chemical?
I can address that. Yeah, each pesticide is going to be on the pesticide label. If there's a pre-harvest interval, if there's a cutoff date, it's going to be specific by product. That is on the federally approved label, so that's done by the EPA.
Okay.
There's one restriction in Iowa that I didn't talk about, and that is the B rule, that applications between 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. are prohibited to a flowering crop within 1 mile of a registered apiary.
I would add to that, Vanya, too, it has to be a pesticide that has a B warning on the label. So
correct. Thank you, Mark.
Yeah, we do get a lot of calls, you know, and the callers don't know what's being applied. And so we get a lot of calls, especially aerial season, when planes are out and about around apiaries. And so that other caveat. So we'll follow up on that. We'll find out what was applied. If it was a product without a B warning, there's no violation there as far as the B rule is concerned. There may be something else, but the B rule, if it doesn't have a B warning on the label, would not apply.
Okay. This particular question comes from a viewer in Minnesota. So the kind of regulations will be a little different there. But they're asking, I was told by our Minnesota Pesticide Division that the farmer and or the applicator does not have to tell me or them what they are spraying or who is doing the spraying. Do I have any rights in this regard? I'm assuming to knowing what is sprayed.
I'll go again. I can't answer for Minnesota. I don't know specifically if they have notification requirements. Again, in Iowa, it's not applicable to ag. I do always, especially when I was an investigator and talking to people that had bees, that is always something that I encouraged every complainant to do, was to have a line of communication with neighboring farmers. The B rule does not require that communication, that notification. Most beekeepers would tell me if they just knew when it was going to happen, they would lock up their bees. That B rule was renegotiated years ago and was a compromise, and that compromise was, it went to bee check, and then those applicators, again, if they're a commercial applicator that's applying a product that has a bee warning on it, they are required to go to that registry and look for that apiary if there's a registered apiary. So there is two-way communication on that. And Iowa is at the top of the list in almost every category in there, especially when it comes down to the number of applicators registered and the number of apiaries that are registered. So it's highly used in Iowa, and the sensitive crop registry is I think we're first or second. I think we're second in that one. So again, Iowa has used that service and utilized that very well. But certainly a line of communication where the law may fall short, if you have that line of communication with your neighbors, that's highly useful.
Okay. And then I'm going to kind of follow off of that. I'm going to combine two questions into one here that follow nicely after that conversation, Mark. The first part of the question is, have you had any cases of investigation involving native plant and seed production, followed by what is the value of registering our bees or orchards? And that's kind of open to whoever wants to grab that.
Yeah, and I'll go back to that value. The value is there on that registry. That there is a communication piece there. And they've expanded that registry to include field check for workers. So seed corn companies, seed bean companies can register where their workers are going to be at, and so it is a very useful communication tool. And as far as natives, I can think of one that I was involved in. I don't know of any others. And in that instance, it was a boom as the turn happened. The spray boom went over the fence line and sprayed into an area. It was actually a buffer of oats. It didn't affect the native species at all, but was an overspray or an actual physical overspray where the boom got left on over a fence line. But that individual had also had some drift incident previous to that. And I think in both instances, there were residues found and there were at least warning letters that went out to those applicators.
Yeah, let me pile on both those questions just a little bit too.
Mm-hmm.
As far as native bees are concerned, when we were first hit, we asked about our native bees. And at the time, the answer, and this is 2012, so this is a while ago, we received the response that no, it does not include native bees or native pollinators. However, we actually added honeybees after that onto our farm so we could be on the list. So it was just a way to defend ourselves a little bit with something that fit the system. But I also want to point out that if you do have a problem with drift and you are worried about your native pollination or your native pollinator populations, I don't think you should ignore the fact that this has happened. And there are ways for you to look for a decline in pollination services in your property. That you could then see that perhaps you're not getting the same, in our case, we weren't getting the same production in our cucumbers and melons and crops that are very pollinator intensive. They need them for production. We also did some sampling over time, some observations of how many pollinators we had. We also noticed that some of our wildflowers that typically reseed and restart began declining after the spray incident. So there are ways that you can collect this information. The problem is, once again, is it's more work. That's why a lot of people don't do it. And that's probably why we don't have a whole lot of information on it, is because it's more work. It's hard to do. And usually it's people who, like myself, have so much going on. It's kind of hard to add one more thing to your job list. So in relation, though, to registry, what value is there in registering? I will tell you from our case, we actually went through litigation, and the fact that we were registered and the information was public bode very well for us. There was a reason we eventually got compensation. It was out of court. We did not go to the court case, but our lawyer did tell us that he encouraged us, you should go to court because you will get a lot more. The problem is we were tired. After 2.5 years of doing everything we needed to do for the legal case, we just wanted to finish it, and we settled for an amount that covered our losses exactly. We didn't get anything more than that. So the point is, though, because we had the registry, and the registry is public information, you can point to, we're doing what we can to let people know we exist and that we have sensitive crops and that we have pollination services we're worried about. That all bodes well in your favor. So that's the value we get. And I can tell you, we got specific value out of it.
Okay. So I also saw that, Rob, you had answered a question in the chat, kind of related to that, about what to do if your hive actually dies. Just wondering if you mind verbalizing it, because the chat's moving pretty quick, so people might have missed that.
Yeah, I'm trying to keep up with the chat a little bit with some of the questions. We did have a hive. We had a hive in the spray zone, and they did in fact die immediately. I mean, next day. So of course, there's not a whole lot you can do about the dead bees. They're dead. And there's also the issue of, if you had any honey in there, then the honey is probably contaminated. So you could have it tested, I suppose, if you have the money to do so. So in our case, we went through the process of, we knew how much a replacement was going to cost. We also had to think about how much honey we typically would get from a hive and figure out the value of that honey. But also you have to think about all the labor costs, because you're probably going to have to clean out the hive. You're probably going to have to strip out everything in the super, and all of your frames are going to have to get cleaned out. There's a lot of extra work. So you need to keep track of the extra labor and then assign that an appropriate labor value. And the number will be probably a little bit higher than you would expect because of that labor. And that's kind of where we came up with our number.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that. It really did get lost in the chat, so I want to make sure it got in there. Okay, I'm gonna switch gears a little bit in questions here, and we have about 10 more minutes of Q&A time. So if you do have a question, feel free to go ahead and type it into the chat, and I will make sure that one of our fabulous hosts answers it for you. The question is, if one of my workers is harmed by pesticide drift, is it their obligation to file suit or mine as the employer?
I would say this begins as a workers' compensation matter. So you as the employer presumably have workers' compensation coverage, and that would be a claim made by the employee against it. Of course, if then you as the victim of the drift or the recipient of the unintended product still have the right to pursue your own claim and could include that as part of what you also need to be compensated for. Because your rates will probably go up.
Yeah, and I can answer from the standpoint from an investigation. We would follow up with the complainant and the employee to determine whether there was a misuse, human contact. But there is no requirement for anyone to call in a pesticide incident. It may be under a different law, whether it be workers' compensation or OSHA or whatever, with the exception being if they are agricultural workers, then the worker protection standard, which is a federal standard, would apply there.
And then from my standpoint as the person who might have hired somebody, that's why I mentioned employee safety is a paramount item. Anytime somebody was spraying in an adjacent field or a plane came to our area, we pulled everybody. Rather than get into a situation where there had to be a workers' comp claim and our rates go up and we have to go through all the processes involved, we actually chose to take the loss in productivity rather than risk somebody that we're responsible for getting harmed. And that's up to every individual farm to do, but that was our decision and our logic for that decision.
Okay. All right. Is there a test of some sort that a community or school adjacent to corn, soy, or crop fields could place on the property to test if pesticides are drifting or suspended in the air?
That's a really great question. It's actually something I've been asking, and I've talked with Emily at PAN about a few times. Part of the issue is the fact that anytime you do testing, you need to know what you're testing for. So already you're behind the 8 ball, selecting something that will adequately identify that you had drift from an application. So that's difficult to begin with. And then, of course, some of the things, there's these little cards that we've tried a couple times, these little yellow cards, but it reacts to some other things other than pesticides too. And their efficacy for how long they work is relatively short. So thus far, other than the drift catcher that we used for a while, and that was an older project, there aren't easy ways to just set something out there and have an alarm go off saying, hey, drift is happening. You have to kind of watch what's going on around you. And I wish it were better than that. And I really think as humans, we could do better than this, but nobody's spending the time and money to develop what needs to be done. That's my personal opinion, not anybody else's.
All right. And then this kind of ties into that a little bit. And I think you may have answered this, but I'll go ahead and read the question. Combinations of pesticides are often applied. Each formulation has inert and proprietary ingredients that aren't disclosed. The pesticide investigation that was conducted on my land determined drift tested for a single active ingredient of one of the pesticides used. Is it common for investigations to pick up on only one active ingredient and test for that?
Yeah, I can touch on that. So in the slide that I showed where there was multiple fields around a target area or the complainant's field, when I investigated it, first and foremost, find out what was applied on the field that I was looking at, so the complainant's field. And it may start to pull products out that we can't test for. So say somebody sprayed that Enlist field with Enlist and Roundup and clethodim or Select. And then we start going to the neighboring fields and find out there was dicamba, Roundup, and clethodim. And then the next dicamba field, it was dicamba, Roundup and clethodim. They may have different names, but they all have the same active ingredient. The only product that we can test for then at that point to prove whether there was a drift or off-target movement is dicamba. So the tests are expensive. We do test for knowns, as what Rob is saying. We have to have a target application. There may be multiple, we follow up with multiple fields. But we will start to take out things that, if it was sprayed on the field or if it was sprayed on every field, obviously we're going to find it. So that's not uncommon.
Okay. And we only have about 5 more minutes left. There is going to be another Q&A session after our next speaker. So if we don't get your question around this time, we will next time. Rob, you did have one pop up in the chat. Just someone wanting briefly to know if you filed a claim for personal damages after being directly sprayed on yourself.
Yeah, that's a great question. We had to make some decisions once we found a lawyer as to what we were going to pursue. And so part of the discussion was what's the least painful process to go through for us, because we were still trying to farm and do everything else. And that was to simply pursue the losses. And that if we could prove negligence, there's a possibility that a multiplier could have been applied to that because they were negligent in the process of spraying. And so we chose to do that rather than seeking personal damages, which is a completely different animal, is my understanding. I think probably Karen could probably speak to how they're different rather than me trying to parrot what I heard from my own lawyer. But we were given choices on what we could do. And because we wanted to get our losses back so our farm wouldn't go under, that's what we focused on, partly because we felt like we could maybe get the compensation faster. The result is in 2.5 years, we finally settled out of court for the amount that we had identified as an exact amount that we had lost. There was no additional pain and suffering, if you want to call it that, or any of those other things on there. There was no interest involved, which maybe we should have asked for. But you get the idea of what we did. And it was partly our choices as informed by an attorney that we, after interviewing multiple attorneys, chose because we felt we could trust them to lead us through the process. It wasn't even necessary that that individual was highly proficient in the use of pesticides, the whole thing involved there. It was more the fact that they could navigate the litigation process and help us understand what we were doing and why it was happening. So we chose a person who had some knowledge, but was very good at helping and explaining us what we needed to do, why we were doing it. If we had a lawyer that we did not trust and he was not, or she was not good at that, we would have worn out and probably given up. So I strongly suggest that you find an individual that you feel comfortable with and feel that they are advising you well.
No, we have about 2 more minutes. Karen, did you want to add to that?
Rob said it well. The important thing is to find an attorney whom you can trust and respect and is willing to work well with you. And all those factors that he mentioned, it's always going to be an individual situation to consider what's the best route, what's the best time, what you want to pursue. So I second what Rob said.
Okay. We have about 1 minute, but the one question I have left is actually going to take a little over that. So I'm looking for a shorter one here. So again, if I did not get to your question during this Q&A, do not worry about that. I will get to it after our next speaker of the day. So we'll hear from her, and then we'll have another Q&A session right after. So Emily, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. So I'm a senior scientist at PAN. I've been at Pesticide Action Network for 10 years, almost 11 now. And I am originally a biologist. One thing I really like about working at PAN is I get to work with organizers and communications folks on a lot of things. But when I first started, I was doing air monitoring in the Midwest, in Minnesota and Iowa mainly. And that is actually how I met Rob and Liz Colby for the first time. So I've actually been all over Iowa, but I'm originally from California, and I've gotten to learn a little bit about a lot of things while I've been working at PAN. So next slide, please. Thanks. So this slide reports a little bit of information from this pesticide atlas that was created by a number of NGOs, and the source is down there at the bottom of the slide. It has some kind of basic info on pesticides in the US in one of the chapters. And my colleague Margaret Reeves wrote this chapter, I think, on her own. But anyway, these are the top commodity crops in the US that have a pretty pesticide intensive uses. So that's corn, soybean, and cotton. The biggest use in the US is herbicides, and those account for a lot of actually global pesticide use. And then finally, in California in particular, we have a lot of specialty crops. So conventional production of specialty crops typically involves pesticide use. And this bullet here on California indicates California uses quite a bit of pesticides compared to the rest of the US. So there's not a lot of studies on pesticide drift distances and incidence, but one of the most informative ones I've seen is from a program called Sensor, which I believe lives in the Centers for Disease Control. And Sensor collects data on pesticide incidents from about 13 or maybe more states in the US. This program focuses on the most ag intensive states in the country. And this publication that I don't have the link to here, but I can supply it, is about acute pesticide illnesses associated with off-target pesticide drift from agricultural applications in 11 states. And that was published in 2011. But it's the best reference I've found for kind of a general overview of pesticide drift incidents. And there's a lot of interesting things in the paper, but just a couple that I can say it includes is, for instance, it talks about some of the biggest drift events. All but one of the 10 biggest drift events in the period that the paper reported on were in California. The 10th one was in Texas. And then there's also distances reported in the paper. And that's really interesting just because pesticide drift can actually occur for up to a mile and cause an incident, but that has to do, again, with like the temperature inversions and other weather conditions that can result in conditions that that contribute to a drift event like that. So those are relatively rare, but then probably the most common distances reported in a table in that paper that are cause events that result in illness are about 1/4 mile, maybe a little more, up to 1/2 mile was the bulk of the incidents that are described in this study. So it's worth looking at, and it is, I think, the definitive study that I've been able to find on pesticide drift in the US when it comes to incidents. So next slide, please. These are just kind of the main things I'm going to touch on today. I tried to gather them in like a couple of themes. So I'm going to touch on animal health just because the question came up when we were getting ready for this this webinar, and also of course human health, which we've talked about a lot today, where to get information or support, reporting a little bit, and then something about long-term concerns just to wrap up. So the relative frequency of pesticide poisoning cases can generally reflect how widely a product is used in the environment. And oh, I forgot to say next slide, excuse me. I'm so used to controlling my own. So routes of exposure for someone, those are on the left. And then what systems could be affected are listed here on the right-hand side. So I'm missing a few from this list. For as an example, kidneys can be affected by pesticide poisonings, and cardiovascular system is another one. And I'm going to mention a really good reference book that's from EPA called Recognition and Management of Pesticide Poisonings. And I'll share the link later on in the talk, and you can access that online. Next slide, please. So this slide shows some of the general symptoms of acute pesticide poisonings. This graphic's from a partner group we work with a lot, Californians for Pesticide Reform. It's from their old drift kit. I don't think their new one has this. But the definition of acute pesticide poisoning, there's not like a standardized case definition. So in the US EPA defines it as when a large amount of pesticide is absorbed over a short time. And then as in another example, the WHO, the World Health Organization, defines acute pesticide poisoning as any illness or health effect resulting from exposure to a pesticide within a short time. And that could be, for example, for about 48 hours. The standardized case definition part is also really interesting because it also affects, I think, how pesticide poisonings get studied. And that's a personal interest of mine that I can talk about more later. So the symptoms of pesticide poisoning are often described as flu-like, and they can and are often dismissed as something other than poisoning. So that's a factor that leads to poisonings being underdiagnosed. Other barriers that, in addition to not recognizing that you've been poisoned, or doctors not recognizing that that their patient's been poisoned, is just that doctors may not be familiar with the signs and symptoms of poisonings. So that was mentioned in the chat earlier. And that's why providing them with the EPA reference book I just mentioned, that's always a good thing. An OBGYN I used to work with several years ago told me that in her medical school education, the environmental health section was covered in a couple of hours. And that's the part where pesticide exposures could have been covered, but it was only, a short time out of everything else covered in their curriculum. So a lot of doctors, if they pick it up, if they see it, they pick it up if they are interested in learning it personally. And it's they also might seek out continuing medical education credits or something like that, but it's not widely covered in a medical school. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about the immediate steps to take post-exposure. If you've been drifted on, it's absolutely essential, and I think the other speakers have kind of have emphasized this, but it's absolutely essential that you prioritize health and safety first. Rob told me in conversation, don't be a Rob. I think that he may have probably focused, like a lot of people would, on some of the work that had to be done. But the first thing is to know is that the length of time of exposure does matter. So you want to eliminate the source of exposure. That's your first priority. You can't help yourself, or you can't help your others if you don't help yourself. And so that means you got to figure out, the first thing to do is leave the area, warn others also. But leaving the area could include, as Rob mentioned earlier, your house, if the drift came inside, or any building that you're in. You also would want to take your pets. Sorry, I'm trying to look at the slide, but it's very hard. So that's why there's some pauses. So you want to take your pets, you want to turn off the HVAC in your house, close windows and doors. You want to remove your clothing and your shoes, and you want to save it in a plastic bag. That's important because then you have evidence of being drifted on for later analysis if or when you need to follow up. And once you've removed your clothing, you're going to wash off with plenty of soap and water. And for eye exposures, if you got pesticide in your eye, I think the first thing you want to do before you even remove clothing maybe would be to irrigate your eyes. And what I read in the EPA handbook I just mentioned, copious water for at least 15 minutes. And at the top, I put, if you feel ill, seek medical care. And I haven't talked to a lot of people who've been drifted on, but a few. And I suspect just from conversation, a lot of people put this off, seeking medical care, because of the time it takes, and they feel okay once they remove themselves from the source of the drift. But and then there's additional fears depending on the person, like they're worried about keeping their job, or because they're undocumented, or a combination of factors. But there's actually, if you have questions, you can call. So I'm coming back to this next slide. So if you're going to report, which you should write down what happened. That includes information like the date, the time, and the location. Taking pictures, anything that you think is an important detail, you should write it down. Those are all good things to do, important things to do, and you should also report as soon as you can. I know Practical Farmers of Iowa has a really good drift booklet that has this basic info that you should keep track of. And the In Case of Drift kit from PAN also has a section on what kind of notes you would want to take. So back to the health aspect, whether or not you seek medical care, you can call poison control centers with any questions you have. You could call them right away as soon as the incident happens. If you're not, I know in rural areas, sometimes hospitals are like miles away and it takes time, but you can call them right away with any questions you have. And also poison control centers annually, they publish their data on poisonings. That includes pesticide poisonings data. They report what data they collect publicly. There's also the National Pesticide Information Center. This is a center based in Oregon, and they get some funding from EPA, and they actually report incidents or share that data with EPA on incidents that they get calls about. They have limited hours, but they are also perfectly willing to address questions you may have, like poison control centers, and they'll refer you to possibly other groups, not local groups, but they might reference, another information resource. And they have a website also. And finally, getting drifted on is often a really quite a traumatic event from the folks I've talked to, and you can seek additional help. NPIC, the National Pesticide Information Center, sometimes reminds callers that 211 can connect you to local resources. And I forgot to put Farm Aid on this slide, although I don't know much about Farm Aid. So Farm Aid has a hotline where you can talk to someone, and they also have connections with rural support organizations. If anyone has a comment about if they've connected with them, I'm pretty curious about the experience, but they have a hotline, 1-800-FARM-AID, and they run from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. Eastern time. Next slide, please. So this question came up while we were getting ready for the webinar. And I didn't get the chance to investigate this very much, nor did I follow up with Liz Colby, who told me she knows a vet, but I will. NPIC provides this information on their website. The first bullet, this phone number is for the ASPCA's Animal Poison Control Center. So if you need to get advice, they might charge a fee. When I started looking up and trying to figure out or find out something about the Animal Poison Control Center, I did find this abstract that there's a asterisk at the bottom. And they reported that calling in can cost $65 in 2018. So you can look up that abstract. It's about epidemiology of suspected livestock poisonings. And then the other thing I found when I was searching online was general information from the Merck veterinary manual, and that's free. There is a pet owner tab and a vet tab. So the vet tab is a little more technical, and there's sections on different kinds of poisonings actually that might be of interest. So not just pesticides, but also antifreeze and other hazards that pets or livestock might encounter. And it also groups it by different kinds of pesticide. So that's another thing I'd be curious to hear more about if folks wanted to talk or share something about pet or livestock concerns, because I'm always interested in seeing what we can do to update PANS in case of drift kit. And one thing I didn't find information on when I was looking, and I wouldn't search for a long time, but Rob had also mentioned to me that he didn't know when poultry or eggs would be safe to eat after a drift incident. And I couldn't find anything. I'm curious about that for sure. So if folks have a resource to share, and I'm going to follow up with Liz to see what her vet contact knows. Next slide, please. So this is to tell us we're going back to health impacts. So again, these are general symptoms of pesticide exposure and acute pesticide poisoning. For WHO's definition, my colleague liked that the best, but any symptom occurring within a short time after pesticide exposure. Next slide, please. So again, because a lot of doctors don't get too much education about pesticide poisonings, one thing you can share with your doctor is whether your state requires medical reporting. Collecting that kind of data, that helps because it provides evidence that there is a problem, and not all medical professionals necessarily know if there's a state requirement for reporting. So this map, this picture of a map is from Migrant Clinicians Network. And you can access that on the website below at the bottom of the slide. But you can check if your state requires reporting for medical incidents. And yeah, this is a reminder. It's important to mention this if you're going to the doctor. They should be familiar with it, but it's yet another piece of paperwork that they may not recall or may not be paying much attention to. So yeah, the other reference I was talking about, the EPA recognition and management of pesticide poisonings, that is a resource that I use pretty often when I'm talking about pesticide incidents. And it's easier to search for this using just that title, but the link is in case of drift, and I'll show it in an upcoming slide. And finally, the Migrant Clinicians Network website. This is also actually a good resource for individuals, but also there's some information for doctors on taking an environmental history, which can be important for documenting chronic effects, especially, but in general for pesticide drift incidents that affect people. So that resource might be useful as well. And it's also described, there's a chapter on taking an environmental history in the recognition book, the EPA book I was just talking about. Next slide, please. Okay, this is a long one, so bear with me. When people call PAN about pesticide exposure, I used to answer more questions than I do now, but they're often asking about information on chronic effects. And again, in the EPA book I was talking about, there's a chapter at the end about chronic effects. So chronic effects are also known as persistent effects, and they're often from low-level exposures that are happening over a greater period of time. So something like an exposure to pesticide residues on food, that's like a chronic effect, or a typical, what you think of when you're talking about a chronic effect. But sometimes chronic effects can be something, effects that linger after an acute poisoning. They can occur after you've been exposed to a lot of pesticide. So one thing I want to note here is the difference between adults and children. So the American Academy of Pediatrics in 2012, they issued a report on children and pesticides, and they stated at the end of their abstract, children's exposure to pesticides should be limited as much as possible. So there's reasons for that statement. Children are still developing. They're more susceptible to exposures to environmental contaminants. Exposure during early development, so before birth, like prenatally or early in life, can result in effects that are longer term or are more impactful, I guess, is maybe a way to put it. So those effects could be greater or more impactful than exposure to pesticide during adulthood. The other thing about kids is they are early in life spending a lot of time on the floor. They're exploring the world using hand-to-mouth activity, and that creates more potential for oral exposure. And for their body weight, children also take in more food and water than an adult does. The diet for children, that's also different. So a lot of kids consume a lot of fruits. And one example I hadn't thought of or read about before that I just looked at or just saw in the EPA book, apple-based products, they're very common in US children's diets, but apples are also a pretty pesticide-intensive crop. So residues exposure for children might be greater during like a key developmental stage. Some of the best known effects on children's neurodevelopment or brain development, that's from some of the most recent very compelling studies have been on exposure to an organophosphate pesticide called chlorpyrifos. Pan talks a lot about chlorpyrifos. We've been campaigning against about banning chlorpyrifos specifically. That's not always the focus of our work, but chlorpyrifos is one of those that, you know, Pan's been saying for like 20 plus years, we need to ban it. And in the US, actually, it's no longer used on food products anymore, but it's still being used elsewhere in the world. So I just interrupted myself, but some of the best known effects on kids' brain development, they're often on studies on chlorpyrifos, but they might also be on general exposure to organophosphate pesticides. And that's a lot of prenatal effects have been reported. So studies have reported associations of prenatal exposure with increased risk of autism spectrum disorder, or they've found differences in markers that are used to measure brain development and function. That's a very general sentence. There's a lot of more specific information that you can find. And sometimes Pan blogs about it. And there's various places to find information on organophosphate insecticides. In adults, there's been adverse effects reported on neurologic function. So some examples of the way that might be measured in a study on adults, that's by testing aspects of coordination or by surveying symptoms, self-reported symptoms. So in studies like this, if you're not familiar with the groups that kind of get studied in a study that has a finding like this, it's usually people who are the most exposed. So like a professional pesticide applicator, that's a key group that would get studied to collect these kinds of data. We get a lot of questions about glyphosate and cancer risk. So quite famous pesticide and quite very, very highly used. So you may have heard that the WHO's International Agency for Research on Cancer found glyphosate to be possibly carcinogenic in 2015. So glyphosate's not the only pesticide that can be carcinogenic. There's, for example, fumigant pesticides are a pretty classic example of carcinogenic pesticides, but I thought I would talk a little bit about glyphosate specifically because there's been so much debate and attention on this. So if you look up IARC and glyphosate, you can actually find that IARC created a landing page on the monograph because of the controversy that monograph on glyphosate caused. And you probably also know that the EPA and the European Union both have had different findings in their assessment of glyphosate carcinogenicity. So there's, just to really briefly sum up, there's differences in risk assessment frameworks, and that can influence the outcome of the assessment. So one thing is the IARC used all publicly available relevant studies. EPA relies primarily on industry-funded studies that work with their risk assessment framework. Another factor is the influence of the chemicals industry over the EPA, particularly when it comes to the Office of Pesticide Programs. Pesticide industry influence can be really strong because they have almost unlimited resources, and they have also the ability, the finances and ability to generate studies, to pay contractors to do that, and they can publish reviews in academic journals. Because of their resources, they can also hire people who have a really, really strong familiarity and time to study and learn more about the framework and how studies might fit into the risk assessment framework that EPA uses. Sometimes for academic papers, academics might focus, like a researcher at a university might focus on something that has a more novel and maybe more cutting edge angle to the study, but this doesn't always fit into the framework by EPA. Even though EPA might look at a study, the data may not fit as handily, I guess. So there's been criticism for EPA risk assessment framework for years, that it relies on industry generated data. It prioritizes toxicology and chemistry data, and it doesn't incorporate additional research like endocrine disruption research as part of their whole picture of pesticide health risks. And my last comment, just sometimes people dismiss concerns over carcinogenicity because everything causes cancer. I still haven't come up with a great response to that, but I think it's interesting that, there's just to say that when you're exposed to a carcinogen, your body is maybe exposed to a number of carcinogens, right? You're not just exposed to one thing over your lifetime. And so all these little kind of hits to your system, they can result in increasing your risk. And I think that's something to really be aware of when you're thinking about, oh, everything causes cancer. I don't find this to be a productive comment, but yes, and yes, it's not true. No, it's not true. So the last thing, last two things. Endocrine disruption. So this is basically, this term refers to how hormonal function can get disrupted by environmental chemicals, and included in that category are reproductive effects. So for example, preconception exposure of the mother or father to pesticides can have an effect on the reproductive outcome and can have an effect on offspring. And maternal exposure to pesticides, like during pregnancy and breastfeeding especially, should be minimized. And there's some data on asthma, the role of pesticides in development of asthma or possibly making asthma worse. That's still being investigated, but it is discussed in the EPA book and also under study in cohort studies like the agricultural health study, which is also a great study. Okay, so next slide. Here's the EPA handbook. There's a picture of it. You can download it. They don't have hard copies available anymore. And it's a very good reference to provide to your doctor. It was written by an MD, and there's 6 editions. I think we're on the 6th one, if I remember right. Yeah. So next slide. I listed a few additional resources on this slide. Most of the web pages I mentioned in this talk are listed in PANS in case of drift kit and UCSF, the Pesticides Matter picture. That's various booklets, including one on pesticides on their Toxic Matters page. US Right to Know has a really nice page that discusses some of the debate around glyphosate and cancer, and you can look up active ingredients or products at pesticideinfo.org or NPIC's product search database. And I'm sure PFI has sent this around every time there's something on drift, but they have just an excellent page with drift resources, including the PFI drift booklet and Farminars on drift featuring Rob, and another one featuring Andy from Grinnell Family Farm about seeking compensation after a drift incident. So that's it. Sorry, I went over a little bit. Thanks.
No, that's perfectly fine. Thank you, Emily, so much for that. Really appreciate you coming in, even virtually from the West Coast. So thanks. All right, so we are going to have one last Q&A session. This one's a little shorter, about 15 minutes. And then there's one question I want to get to that was unfortunately kind of pushed off from last session just because we ran out of time. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into it. And if you do have questions for any of our speakers now, including Emily, go ahead and pop them in the chat. So this question from earlier is, I have a cornfield directly across the road south from my nut and fruit orchards. I stopped a young man spraying earlier this year, and he assured me that the landowner farmer had told him not to spray the 25 corn rows near his road to protect my orchards. Is that enough distance? He also said he was spraying fungicide and that would not hurt my trees. Is that true? And we answered the question about the bees, but distance-wise, what's a good distance, and would fungicide hurt trees?
I hope Rob has a good answer to buffer zone. Buffer zone, what he prefers, probably 20 miles away or nowhere is what I just.
Yeah, this is a really actually more complex question than it seems, because all pesticides have more or less tendency to drift. The way somebody applies the pesticide can affect how much it can move. For example, most equipment, you can control the droplet sizes, and a higher droplet size tends to not to catch the wind as much, so is less likely to drift. And of course, each product might have different impacts on your fruit trees or your bees. Typically, so in other words, the answer is there's no perfect answer for you, which I wish I had I could wave a wand and give you an exact number. Now, what I can tell you is, as a certified organic grower, we were required to have a 30-foot buffer strip between us and the area around us, which could include the road. However, on our farm, we've gone so far as to also grow up vertical buffers to try and catch some of the drift that's possible, and rather than let it get into where our crops are or other things that we're more worried about. We did learn one thing that wasn't a good idea, is we started with smaller plants and graduated to larger plants as we came into the farm. And we learned that if a wind was coming that way, that actually provides a ramp where it just goes up over the top and drops a little bit further into our farm, which was a bad thing. So probably having something bigger on the outside going to smaller, or even better yet, having larger bushes and trees on the edge with some small grasses intermixed is probably a good filter for the rest of the farm. As far as fungicides and trees are concerned, my biggest concern with fungicides is that they often will take care of and get rid of fungicide or fungus that are important for the healthy growth of our plants, including your trees. Fungicides are not necessarily going to be selective. They're going to kill fungus. And many of those fungi are needed for healthy plants and healthy systems. And so that is typically how a fungicide can affect your plants is by taking out some of the healthy systems that they need to be a good healthy specimen.
Okay.
I
No,
was going to say, I can add a little bit. I agree, Rob. Without knowing exactly what pesticide it is, it's tough to answer that question exactly. This, from an investigation standpoint, I can say that there were times where I did a site assessment and really thought that there's no way I'm going to find a pesticide residue here. And there were times where I thought, surely it's going to show up. And I would fight making those assumptions, take the sample and test it. And a lot of times I was surprised where I didn't expect to find it, I would. And when I thought for sure I would, I wouldn't. We let the investigation speak, the evidence speak, and not our opinions. So if you suspect drift, you call it in, and if we can pull a sample and find it, that's the only way we can know for sure. But yeah, as far as an appropriate buffer, it really depends on a lot of factors: wind direction, wind speed, application equipment. I agree with Rob.
And let me pile on to Mark here a little bit, at the risk of giving you more work, Mark. Let me one more time iterate. And I know sometimes I was seeing some things in the chat that in other states and perhaps in Iowa, people feel that it's a worthless task to call in a possible pesticide drift or pesticide misapplication situation. And personally, I can tell you, I know exactly how you feel, because the Pesticide Bureau was only there for enforcement purposes. They're not really there so much for me. However, if you can put it beyond just being about you and consider that the only way we can gather information about how bad things can be with pesticide drift and movement of pesticides is by making these reports, then make it more about everybody, not just you, and make the darn report. Even if you're just a little bit suspicious, make the report. Don't let somebody, and if somebody's having a bad day when you call on the report, or maybe Minnesota or Illinois is not as kind to callers as our folks at the Pesticide Bureau in Iowa have been, at least to us, make the report anyway and tell them I'm going to make the report. Because this is how we can perhaps learn what's going on and perhaps make adjustments and changes that are necessary. And I guess that's me getting on the soapbox. So now I will step back off and we can move on to your questions.
I'll add a little bit more if I can, Rob, too, because the point that I didn't make before. I did talk about we can't force anybody to make a complaint. That has to be your decision. And in some senses, to continue with that complaint. There also, I wanted to point out too, the state does not charge for that service. So if we pull a sample, you're not going to get charged for the sample. But at the same time, if we're out on an investigation, somebody later photographs showed some instances where we went out and did a site assessment and determined there were not signs and symptoms of pesticides, but something else. We may not pull a sample, and that doesn't always make people happy, but we're going to try to make the best use of the resources that we have and not needlessly spend taxpayer dollars. So in some cases, we may not pull a sample, maybe because the timing of the application, and that will upset people, but there's reasons that we do that. And it's not that we don't want to prove, or help prove, say, the applicator story. We do try to remain unbiased, but we're going to do, what's in the best interest of that investigation, taxpayer money, and do the best job we can.
all right, thank you. I kind of want to circle back to Rob directly real quick. As it seems like this one's geared towards you. It's what you were talking about earlier about buffers and keeping a distance. One of our viewers wants to know, what do you use for vertical buffers?
Yeah, that's a great question. I can answer this two ways. What do we use, and what maybe should I have been using? Because some of what we did ended up not being the best solution. For example, we did one area of our farm where we did all kinds of bushes from the DNR, all the native Iowa rootstock that a person can get if you're trying to establish a windbreak, for example. You could get some bushes like serviceberry, or now, of course, the names are leaving me. But we went with a lot of the native Iowa species and ran the edge of our farm with them. Nine bark was another one we had. We had high bush cranberry. We put in some wild plums. See, they're coming back to me. This is good. So those are some of the bushes we put in. And then initially we went with a pampas grass, which ended up being probably a bad choice because it's invasive and going everywhere. And we should have gone with some native grasses, like big blue stem or little blue stem or some of those kinds of things for Iowa. And again, I mentioned we kind of ramped things a little bit, and that wasn't a good thing. We had grasses on the outside going to the bushes, going to trees that aren't very big. If I were going to do this all over again, for example, depending on the part of the farm, I might have gone with some sort of an evergreen as part of my edge and intermixed that with some grasses, and then maybe had some bushes in there too. And we like the idea of trying to have a diverse habitat as well. I know a lot of people in Iowa like to just put arbovitas, one big row of them. But if you have a disease or if there's any particular issue, they all die at the same time and you have nothing anymore. So the reality is you need to have a buffer, and you want to have a vertical buffer that is also slightly porous, because what will happen is it will filter through and then drop. The pesticide drift will filter through and drop next to and inside of your buffer zone. If you have a perfectly solid block, then it's going to try and go over. And that only puts it further and deeper into your farm. I hope that actually answers some of the questions. We could probably do a PFI webinar all on building buffer strips and buffer zones. That's a fairly big topic.
All right, thank you. So we have about 8 minutes left, so time for a few more questions. I think, Rob, I saw you answering this one in the chat, but I'm going to go ahead and say it out loud, simply in case people missed it in the chat, because it gets going pretty quick sometimes. Weather stations that are used to determine wind speed and directions are airports that are more than 20 miles away from the application area in my area. The topography changes a lot, as do local conditions, but a Department of Transportation weather station 3 miles away was thrown out in our investigation. And if we got our own weather station to get more accurate data, it would not be used in an investigation. So the question is, how then do we get accurate weather data that investigators will use and not data that is from 20 or 30 miles away?
I'll touch on that a little bit. Basically, the best thing I can say is we don't have weather stations everywhere. I, as an investigator, if the complainant had weather data, I would include it in the affidavit, so it was noted in the case. It's usually noted in the incident report as well. So it's not that it wasn't included, or I wouldn't include that information in an investigation. But when we pull our weather data, I don't know the exact number of weather stations we have. It comes from our state climatologist, Justin Gleason, and that's as impartial as we can get. Even a weather station 3 miles away is not on-site data. So, Karen, maybe you can speak to some of this too, and what really is, maybe picked apart in court. But we try to stick with impartial data, and that's our weather stations. I don't know if the DOT stations are included in that or not. I'm sorry, I can't answer that.
Yes, we've used National Weather Service data, which I don't know the mechanics of how they gather it, but it is quite precise as to location.
And yeah, just so everybody can hear some of the things I wrote. In our case, we did invest in a weather station, and it's been long enough. We actually went through a process of identifying weather stations that had some sort of certification for accuracy. And I don't remember what that was, but we invested in it. And when we've made reports, to the Pesticide Bureau. They have accepted the data, but I don't know, you know, typically what happened with us is we got confirmation from a climatologist, so there wasn't an issue. But I can tell you that it's definitely true, and everybody who's been outside and worked outside knows this. The wind speed rating you can get on one side of your farm versus the other can be incredibly different based on placement of buildings, trees, bushes, the whole bit. And of course, we have this vertical buffer on our farm, which can read lower than you might get, say, out in the field. So I wish we had a perfect answer for you on this one. There, again, this is making me feel bad because a lot of these things, we have no perfect answer. And that's why this is such a difficult subject and why we still have a problem. And there needs to be some other things other than response to drift, to prevent drift, that we need to be working on more. I want to put Mark out of his job. I don't want to have any more reports. And I don't want that to be because we all pretend it doesn't happen. I want it because it doesn't happen anymore. There's a reason our farm, and I'm going to soapbox it again, there's a reason we have stepped back from our farm and scaled down, and why I work for somebody else now. It isn't because of the weather. It isn't because of the pests. It isn't because it's a hard job. It's because on top of all that, we've had trouble with pesticide drift. That's the thing that broke our backs. That's why we're backing off of doing this. That's why I'm in these webinars or events. This is not what I chose to do with my life, and yet here I am. Something has to be done so that we don't have to be making these reports and having these webinars. And there's my soapbox again.
No, you're perfectly good, Rob. All right. We have time for one more question. I did have one last question come in. Actually two, but we'll see if we can get them both done. Are there a standard number of samples that are taken, typically taken for an application complaint?
No. It may vary. So if it's a single field and the source is evident, in other words, we do a site assessment and we can tell the direction of it. We have one target field, one sample is sufficient. I don't believe there's any more reason to take more than that. I've had cases where I have been, I've pulled 3 samples from the same field. Again, I'm trying to prove what I can prove. And in the case where there could have been multiple sources, I had, as an investigator, the ability to determine how many samples I could take. I've had organic farms that I went to and have taken 7 samples in 3 fields. I had a case where multiple levels, human contact from an aerial. They also had chickens in a barn and a run outside of that that they believe were contacted. There were horses in a pasture. There was an alfalfa. Well, it wasn't alfalfa. It was a brome grass hay field that they used for horse hay that was on the west side of the property. And I took clothing samples. I took vegetation samples from where he told me he was standing. I took samples next to the chicken coop. I took samples from the horse pasture, and I took samples of the hay that was cut and ready to be baled to determine. Again, there's multiple levels to that case and multiple things that we may be able to prove. If it was just a drift complaint without those other elements, one sample may be enough. So it depends. It really depends on the situation.
All right, thank you, Mark. And we are officially out of time, so I would like to thank everybody for joining. This webinar will be put up on the PFI website very soon. And the resources that were shared in the link, we can upload those as well. All right, so thank you, everybody, and see you very soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Ready?